The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Guard Thompson adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that day. 23 years old and fresh from military training, he had dreamed of this moment since childhood. Standing at attention in his towering bearskin hat, he represented centuries of British tradition and honor. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, almost as heavy as the ceremonial rifle in his white-gloved hands. Thompson had memorized every rule in the manual. Never smile, never speak unless spoken to by an officer, never break formation, never acknowledge tourists, no matter how ridiculous their attempts to get attention. He had practiced for months, standing motionless for hours at a time until his legs felt like concrete pillars. His instructors had drilled into him that he was no longer just Michael Thompson from Manchester. He was a symbol of the crown, a living statue representing the dignity and strength of the monarchy. The tourists began arriving early that Tuesday morning, cameras clicking and flashing like a swarm of mechanical insects. Thompson stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the distant gate, watching everything and acknowledging nothing. A group of American teenagers tried to make him laugh by doing silly dances in front of him. A middle-aged woman from Germany attempted to get his attention by waving a small British flag enthusiastically. An elderly Japanese couple posed beside him, their grandson making funny faces while they took photos. Through it all, Thompson remained perfectly still. His breathing was controlled, his expression neutral. He had become what his training intended, a human monument to British tradition. The tourists eventually grew bored and moved on to find other guards to torment with their cameras and jokes. But Thompson's real test was yet to come. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew larger and more persistent. Tour guides pointed at him while explaining the history of the guards to their groups. Children pressed their faces against the palace railings, trying to catch his eye. Street performers gathered nearby, hoping to draw attention from the steady stream of visitors, fascinated by the motionless soldiers. Thompson's feet began to ache inside his polished black boots. Sweat trickled down his back beneath the heavy wool uniform. The bearskin hat felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and his arms grew tired from holding the rifle in the exact prescribed position. But he endured it all without a flicker of movement or expression. It was then that he noticed her, a small girl, perhaps 6 years old, with curly red hair and freckles scattered across her nose like stars. She stood apart from the crowd, clutching a worn teddy bear and staring at him with the kind of intense curiosity only children possess. Unlike the others who treated him like a curiosity or entertainment, she seemed genuinely puzzled by his stillness. The little girl approached slowly, her mother following behind with an apologetic smile. She stopped just a few feet away from Thompson and tilted her head to one side, studying his face with the seriousness of a scientist examining a specimen. Her mother whispered something about not bothering the guard, but the child seemed lost in thought. Thompson could see her clearly from the corner of his eye, though he continued to stare straight ahead. She was different from the other tourists. There was no malice in her curiosity, no desire to embarrass or entertain herself at his expense. She simply seemed confused by the sight of a grown man standing so perfectly still for so long. The girl raised her small hand and waved tentatively. When Thompson didn't respond, she tried again, this time adding a soft, "Hello, mister." Still no reaction from the guard. She looked back at her mother with a confused expression, as if asking why this strange man wouldn't acknowledge her friendly greeting. What happened next would test every ounce of Thompson's training and self-control, setting in motion a chain of events that would remind everyone present that beneath the uniform and ceremony, the royal guards were still human beings capable of compassion and spontaneous kindness. The little girl stood there for several more minutes, her innocent eyes never leaving Thompson's face. She seemed to be waiting for some sign of life, some acknowledgement that he was indeed a real person and not just an elaborate statue. Her mother gently tugged at her sleeve, encouraging her to move along with the rest of the tour group, but the child remained fascinated. Finally, the girl did something that caught Thompson completely off guard. She carefully placed her teddy bear on the ground in front of him and stepped back. The worn brown bear sat there between them like a peace offering, its button eyes reflecting the morning sunlight. The gesture was so pure and innocent that Thompson felt something stir deep inside his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heavy uniform or the summer heat. The child's mother looked embarrassed and moved forward to retrieve the toy, but her daughter gently stopped her with a small hand. "He looks lonely, Mummy," she whispered loud enough for Thompson to hear. "Maybe he needs a friend while he works." Those simple words hit Thompson like a physical blow. In all his training, no one had prepared him for such genuine kindness from a stranger. The other tourists had seen him as entertainment, a curiosity to be photographed and laughed at. But this little girl saw him as a person who might need companionship during his long, solitary duty. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that something special was happening. Other guards stationed nearby could see what was unfolding, and they too felt the power of the moment. Camera phones emerged from pockets and purses, but for once, the tourists seemed more interested in witnessing genuine human connection than in capturing it for social media. Thompson's resolve began to waver. Every rule in his manual told him to ignore the gesture, to remain stoic and unmoved. But his heart was telling him something different. This wasn't a tourist trying to make him break character for entertainment. This was a child offering comfort to someone she perceived as lonely and isolated. The internal battle raged within Thompson as he stood there, still maintaining his rigid posture, but feeling increasingly conflicted. His commanding officer was nowhere in sight, and the other guards were far enough away that they might not notice a small breach of protocol. The little girl waited patiently, her eyes full of hope that her gift would be acknowledged. Behind him, Thompson could hear the murmur of the crowd growing more invested in the scene. Mothers were pointing out the sweetness of the gesture to their own children. Fathers were lowering their cameras, recognizing that some moments were too precious to interrupt with technology. Even the most jaded tourists seemed touched by the pure innocence of the interaction. The teddy bear continued to sit there, a silent ambassador of childhood compassion. Its fur was matted from years of being loved and carried everywhere. One of its ears was slightly chewed, and its ribbon bow was faded with age. This wasn't just any toy. It was clearly the girl's most treasured possession, and she was willing to share it with a stranger who looked like he needed cheering up. Thompson's training warred with his humanity. He thought about his own younger sister back home, who had once done something similar when she found him crying after a difficult day at school. She had offered him her favorite stuffed elephant, saying nothing but understanding everything. The memory made his chest tight with emotion. The girl's mother knelt down beside her daughter and whispered something in her ear. The child nodded solemnly and took a small step closer to Thompson. "I have to go now," she said quietly, "but my teddy can stay with you if you want. His name is Biscuit, and he's very good at making people feel better." The crowd held its breath. Even the pigeons seemed to pause their constant pecking at crumbs on the cobblestones. The moment stretched out like a rubber band, taut with possibility and emotion. Thompson felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, but more importantly, he felt the weight of one little girl's kindness pressing against his heart. What he did next would be talked about for years to come, shared on social media around the world, and remembered by everyone present as the day they witnessed something truly magical happen in the most unexpected of places. Thompson felt his resolve crumble like ancient stone. The little girl's words echoed in his mind as he stared straight ahead, fighting the biggest internal battle of his young military career. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to remain motionless. But his heart was telling him something entirely different. This wasn't about rules and regulations anymore. This was about basic human decency and the kind of moment that reminds people why kindness matters. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, at first Thompson's eyes shifted downward. He looked at the teddy bear sitting on the cobblestones, then back up at the little girl's hopeful face. The crowd sensed the change immediately. A collective intake of breath rippled through the gathered tourists as they realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. Without breaking his military posture completely, Thompson did something that would have horrified his drill sergeants, but warmed the hearts of everyone watching. He gave the smallest, most subtle nod of acknowledgement to the girl. It lasted barely a second, but it was enough. The child's face lit up like a Christmas tree, her smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the entire courtyard. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Cameras that had been respectfully lowered were raised again, but now to capture something beautiful rather than to mock or entertain. The little girl clapped her hands together with joy, bouncing on her toes as she realized that the serious guard had actually seen her gift and accepted it. But Thompson wasn't finished. In a move that would later be described by witnesses as the most touching thing they had ever seen, he did something else that went completely against protocol. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly and positioned his foot just slightly forward, creating a small protective space around the teddy bear. It was a tiny gesture, but it spoke volumes. He wasn't just acknowledging the gift, he was protecting it. The little girl understood immediately. Her companion would be safe with this kind soldier. She waved goodbye to both Thompson and her teddy bear, then skipped away with her mother, chattering excitedly about how the guard had accepted Biscuit as his friend. Her joy was infectious, spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. Other tourists began to see Thompson differently. Instead of trying to make him break character for their amusement, they started to respect the dignity of his position while also appreciating his humanity. Parents used the moment to teach their children about kindness and compassion. Teenagers, who had been making jokes earlier, fell silent, somehow understanding that they had witnessed something special. Word of the incident spread quickly through the palace grounds. Other guards heard whispered accounts of what had happened, and surprisingly, instead of criticism, Thompson found himself receiving subtle nods of approval from his colleagues. Even the most senior guards seemed to understand that some rules were worth bending when faced with genuine human kindness. The teddy bear remained there for the rest of Thompson's shift, a small brown guardian sitting faithfully at his feet. Tourists who arrived later in the day were told the story by those who had witnessed it firsthand. The tale grew slightly with each telling, but the heart of it remained the same. A little girl had seen past the uniform to the person beneath, and had offered comfort in the simplest, most beautiful way possible. As the hours passed, Thompson found his duty easier to bear. The teddy bear's presence reminded him that his job wasn't just about following rules and maintaining tradition. It was about representing the best qualities of his nation, including compassion, kindness, and the ability to recognize and appreciate the goodness in others. The afternoon brought new challenges, however. A group of rowdy college students had arrived, clearly having spent their morning in one of the local pubs. They were loud, disrespectful, and determined to get the guards, to break character through increasingly obnoxious behavior. They hadn't heard the story of the little girl and the teddy bear, and they had no interest in showing respect for the tradition or the men who upheld it. Their behavior was about to set up a perfect example of how karma works in the most unexpected ways, and how sometimes the universe has a way of rewarding kindness while teaching lessons to those who choose cruelty over compassion. The group of 5 college students approached Thompson's position with the swagger that often comes with too much alcohol and too little wisdom. Their leader, a stocky young man with messy blonde hair and a university football jersey, spotted the teddy bear immediately and burst into mocking laughter. "Look at this!" he shouted to his friends, pointing at Biscuit. "The big scary guard has a teddy bear! How adorable!" His companions joined in the laughter, their voices echoing harshly off the palace walls. The contrast between their behavior and the gentle scene from earlier in the day couldn't have been more stark. The respectful tourists who had witnessed the morning's events looked on with disapproval. Several people tried to quietly explain what had actually happened, but the students were too intoxicated and too caught up in their own entertainment to listen. They had found what they thought was ammunition to embarrass the guard, and they intended to use it. "Hey, soldier boy," the blonde student called out, stepping closer to Thompson. "Did you bring your blankie to work too? Maybe your mummy packed you a lunch in a cute little box?" His friends howled with laughter, filming everything on their phones for what they assumed would be hilarious social media content. Thompson remained perfectly still, but inside he was seething. Not for himself. He had endured worse taunts during training, but for the memory of the little girl's kindness being mocked by these cruel strangers. The teddy bear sat innocently between them, representing something pure that these young men couldn't or wouldn't understand. The ringleader grew, bolder, emboldened by his friend's encouragement and the guard's lack of response. He stepped even closer, now standing directly in front of Thompson with his face twisted in an ugly sneer. "What's wrong, big man? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're too busy playing with dollies to talk to us?" Other tourists began to move, away, uncomfortable with the escalating situation. Parents covered their children's ears and guided them toward other areas of the palace grounds. The atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to tense, with everyone sensing that something unpleasant was about to happen. What none of the students realized was that their obnoxious display had caught the attention of someone very important. Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the Guard Division, had been conducting his routine inspection of the palace grounds when he heard the commotion. A 30-year veteran with a reputation for being both fair and absolutely no-nonsense, he had witnessed the entire confrontation from a distance. The colonel had also heard about the morning's incident with the little girl. In fact, he had been quietly proud of Thompson's handling of the situation, recognizing it as exactly the kind of human moment that reminded people why the monarchy mattered to ordinary citizens. The guard had shown discretion, compassion, and perfect judgment in acknowledging the child's kindness while maintaining his dignity and position. Now, watching these disrespectful visitors mock both his guard and the sweet gesture that had touched so many hearts earlier, Colonel Harrison felt his own sense of justice stirring. He was a man who believed deeply in the principle that actions have consequences, and he was about to demonstrate exactly what that meant. The blonde student, growing frustrated by Thompson's continued silence, made a fatal error in judgment. He reached down toward the teddy bear, intending to kick it away or pick it up to taunt the guard further. "Maybe I should take this little toy home with me," he said with a nasty grin. "Looks like it's not being appreciated here." That was the moment Colonel Harrison chose to make his presence known. His voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and commanding enough to make every person in the courtyard freeze in place. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you, son." The students spun around to see a tall, imposing figure in an immaculate officer's uniform striding toward them. His chest was covered with medals and ribbons earned through decades of distinguished service. His eyes were steel gray and absolutely furious. Even in their intoxicated state, the young men recognized authority when they saw it, and they suddenly realized they might have made a very serious mistake. The crowd that had started to disperse began to gather again, sensing that justice was about to be served. Those who had witnessed the morning's beautiful moment between the guard and the little girl felt a sense of anticipation. Karma, it seemed, was about to make an appearance. Colonel Harrison approached the group with the measured stride of a man accustomed to command. His presence seemed to change the very air around them, transforming the casual tourist atmosphere into something much more serious and official. The students, suddenly aware that they had attracted the attention of someone with real authority, began to shift nervously from foot to foot. "Gentlemen," the colonel said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of 3 decades in the military. "I believe you were about to touch property that doesn't belong to you." His eyes fixed on the blonde student's hand, which was still extended toward the teddy bear. The young man quickly jerked it back, as if he had been about to touch a hot stove. The crowd pressed closer, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Word was spreading quickly through the palace grounds about what was happening, and people were arriving from all directions to witness the scene. Those who had been present earlier began quietly explaining to newcomers about the little girl and her generous gesture, creating a buzz of anticipation. "We were just having a bit of fun," the ringleader stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating under the colonel's steely gaze. "No harm meant, sir, just, tourist stuff." His friends nodded eagerly, suddenly very interested in examining their shoes rather than meeting the officer's eyes. Colonel Harrison's expression didn't soften 1 degree. "Fun," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You consider mocking one of His Majesty's guards to be fun? You think ridiculing an act of kindness from a child is entertaining?" Each word was delivered with precision, like bullets from a rifle. The students exchanged worried glances. What had started as a harmless prank was rapidly becoming something much more serious. They were beginning to realize that they might face real consequences for their behavior, and their alcohol-induced confidence was fading fast. "Let me tell you what happened here this morning," the colonel continued, his voice rising slightly so that the entire crowd could hear. "A 6-year-old girl visiting our country with her family noticed that this guard looked lonely during his duty. So she did what children do when they see someone who might need comfort. She offered to share her most precious possession." The colonel gestured toward the teddy bear, which sat exactly where the little girl had placed it hours earlier. "That teddy bear represents something you 5 young men apparently don't understand: compassion, generosity, and respect for others. This guard acknowledged her kindness with the smallest gesture possible while still maintaining his duty. It was a moment that reminded everyone present why courtesy and decency matter." Several people in the crowd began to applaud, but the colonel raised his hand for silence. He wasn't finished. The students looked like they wanted to disappear into the cobblestones beneath their feet. "Now," he continued, his voice growing colder, "you arrive here, intoxicated and disrespectful, and decide that this touching scene is something to mock. You think it's appropriate to ridicule both the child's kindness and this soldier's humanity. You were about to desecrate a gift given in innocence and accepted with grace." The blonde student tried to speak, but the colonel's raised hand silenced him immediately. "I'm not done. You filmed this encounter, presumably to share your cruelty with others online. You turned what should have been a moment of shame and reflection into entertainment for your social media followers." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even Thompson, still maintaining his position but listening intently, felt a surge of gratitude toward his commanding officer. Someone was finally standing up for the principles he had tried to uphold all day. Colonel Harrison stepped closer to the group, and his next words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Here's what's going to happen, gentlemen. First, you're going to delete every video and photo you took of this guard and this incident, right now, in front of everyone here." The students fumbled for their phones, their hands shaking slightly as they realized the full extent of their predicament. But the colonel wasn't finished dispensing justice. "Second, you're going to apologize, not just to this guard, but to everyone here who had to witness your appalling behavior. And third," his voice took on a tone that made several people in the crowd shiver despite the warm afternoon sun, "you're going to learn exactly why respect for our traditions and our people isn't optional in this country." What happened next would become the stuff of legend, shared in pubs and coffee shops across London for years to come. The swift and perfect justice that followed would serve as a reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe ensures that kindness is rewarded and cruelty meets its match. The 5 students stood there deleting their photos and videos with trembling fingers, while hundreds of tourists watched in satisfied silence. The ringleader's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped his phone twice. The contrast between their earlier arrogance and current humiliation was stark and deeply satisfying to everyone who had witnessed their cruel behavior. "Now the apologies," Colonel Harrison commanded, his voice carrying across the courtyard like a bell. "And I want them to be sincere. Start with the guard." The blonde student stepped forward, his face flushed red with embarrassment and shame. His voice cracked as he spoke. I'm sorry, sir. We were completely out of line. Your dedication to duty is admirable, and we had no right to mock you or the gift you received." His friends mumbled similar apologies, each one looking more miserable than the last. Thompson, still maintaining his position, gave the same subtle nod he had given the little girl earlier. But this time, it wasn't acknowledgement of kindness. It was acceptance of an apology that was both necessary and deeply overdue. "Now apologize to everyone here," the colonel ordered, gesturing to the crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation. The students turned to face the tourists, families, and local visitors who had seen their shameful display. "We're sorry," the ringleader said, his voice stronger now but heavy with genuine remorse. "We disrespected something beautiful and acted like complete idiots. We're ashamed of our behavior, and we understand why you're all looking at us like we're the worst people in the world, because right now we kind of are." The crowd remained silent, but their expressions had softened slightly. There was something to be said for genuine remorse, and these young men were clearly experiencing it in full measure. But Colonel Harrison still wasn't finished. "You mentioned social media," he said, his eyes glinting with something that might have been satisfaction. "I think you should post something after all. I want you to share this entire experience, your disrespectful behavior, your apologies, and the lesson you learned today. Let your followers see what happens when you mock kindness and disrespect tradition." The students looked horrified at the prospect of showcasing their humiliation online, but they were in no position to refuse. They had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone who understood both justice and human nature far better than they did. As the confrontation wound down, something magical began to happen. Other tourists who had heard about the morning's incident started approaching Thompson's position, not to mock or harass, but to leave their own small offerings of respect and kindness. An elderly woman left a bottle of water for him to drink during his break. A young father placed a small British flag near the teddy bear. Children drew pictures and left them on the ground with shy smiles. The 5 college students watched this display of genuine human decency with growing understanding of what they had almost destroyed. They had tried to mock something beautiful and had instead created a moment that brought out the best in everyone around them, everyone except themselves. As evening approached and Thompson's shift neared its end, the little girl returned with her mother. They had heard about the confrontation from other tourists and wanted to check on Biscuit the teddy bear. When the girl saw that her gift was not only still there, but surrounded by other tokens of respect and kindness, her joy was boundless. "Mommy, look!" she exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "Biscuit made lots of new friends, and the guard kept him safe all day, just like I knew he would." Thompson's replacement arrived right on schedule, and as the changing of the guard ceremony began, something unprecedented happened. The crowd that had gathered to watch didn't just observe in respectful silence, they burst into spontaneous applause. They were applauding the tradition, the ceremony, and the reminder that beneath the uniforms and pageantry were real people deserving of respect and capable of extraordinary grace under pressure. The 5 students watched from the back of the crowd, quiet and thoughtful. They had learned more about dignity, respect, and human decency in one afternoon than they had in their entire college careers. As they walked away from the palace grounds, they were already planning how to share their story online. not as the heroes they had imagined themselves to be, but as examples of how quickly arrogance can be transformed into humility when faced with real character and true authority. The teddy bear named Biscuit remained at the palace that night, safely stored away to be returned to its young owner, the IE, next morning. But the story of the little girl's kindness, the guard's humanity, and the swift justice served to those who tried to mock both, spread far beyond the palace walls. Sometimes karma doesn't wait for another lifetime to balance the scales. Sometimes it shows up in the form of a colonel with steel-gray eyes and an absolute commitment to ensuring that kindness is protected and cruelty meets its match. And sometimes the most powerful lessons about human decency come not from books or lectures, but from watching how different people react when faced with the simple, pure generosity of a 6-year-old girl and her beloved teddy bear.